Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, July 9th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The IDF allows free-for-all violence in Gaza. So this article is from 972 magazine, and this is the Israeli outlet that has broken a lot of major stories related to what the Israeli military is doing in Gaza, including the one that detailing the AI system called Lavender that they use to just completely obliterate Gaza and target civilians. And there was another report that said they were purposely targeting civilian targets, what they call power targets, which are residential buildings and public buildings, as part of a strategy, to put pressure on the civilian population of Gaza. It's very obvious that Israel was doing that, but these reports have been really important in shedding light and confirming things that we all suspect. So this story is about how the Israeli army, the Israeli soldiers in Gaza, are essentially allowed to shoot whatever they want, whoever they want. So I'll read some of it. It's a pretty long report. I'll try to hit what I think are the more important parts. So this is by Oren Ziv. In early June, Al Jazeera aired a series of disturbing videos revealing what it described as summary executions. Israeli soldiers shooting dead several Palestinians walking near the coastal road in the Gaza Strip on 3 separate occasions. In each case, the Palestinians appeared unarmed and did not pose any imminent threat to the soldiers. If you remember, one of those videos showed them kill the people on the beach, and then Israeli bulldozers showed up and just buried them right away. And they get into that in this story as well. So such footage is rare due to the severe constraints faced by journalists in the besieged enclave and the constant danger to their lives. But these executions, which did not appear to have any security rationale, are consistent with the testimonies of 6 Israeli soldiers who spoke to 972 magazine and Local Call following their release from active duty in Gaza in recent months. Corroborating the testimonies of Palestinian eyewitnesses and doctors throughout the war, the soldiers described being authorized to open fire on Palestinians virtually at will, including civilians. The 6 sources, all except one of whom spoke on the condition of anonymity, recounted how Israeli soldiers routinely executed Palestinian civilians simply because they entered an area that the military defined as a no-go zone. The testimonies paint a picture of a landscape littered with civilian corpses, which are left to rot or be eaten by stray animals. The army only hides them from view ahead of the arrival of international aid convoys, so that images of people in advanced stages of decay don't come out. 2 of the soldiers also testified to a systematic policy of setting Palestinian homes on fire after occupying them. And that's another thing that we've seen plenty of footage of, IDF soldiers burning down homes. Several sources described how the ability to shoot without restrictions gave soldiers a way to blow off steam or relieve the dullness of their daily routine. So a reservist who went by the name of S for this report said, quote, "People want to experience the event fully. I personally fired a few bullets for no reason into the sea or at the sidewalk or an abandoned building. They report it as normal fire, which is code name for I'm bored, so I shoot," end quote. So essentially, not even just shoot at people. They could just shoot at whatever they want. So it goes on more detail about that, but I want to get into this part. So multiple soldiers testified that the permissive shooting policy has enabled Israeli units to kill Palestinian civilians even when they are identified as such beforehand. So saying that they identify them as civilians, yet they're still allowed to shoot them. We're talking about rifle fire, machine gun fire, mortar fire. We're not talking about airstrikes. This is, people pointing their guns and shooting at people who they know are civilians. So D, a reservist, said that his brigade was stationed next to two so-called humanitarian travel corridors, one for aid organizations and one for civilians fleeing the north to the south of the Strip. Within his brigade's area of operation, they instituted a red line, green line policy, delineating zones where it was forbidden for civilians to enter. According to D, aid organizations were permitted to travel into these zones with prior coordination. They note that this interview was done before they killed the World Central Kitchen employees. But for Palestinians, it was different. D said, quote, anyone who crossed into the green area would become a potential target. If they cross the red line, you report it on the radio and you don't need to wait for permission. You can shoot, end quote. Yet D said that civilians often came into areas where aid convoys passed through in order to look for scraps that might fall from the trucks. Nonetheless, the policy was to shoot anyone who tried to enter. He said, quote, the civilians are clearly refugees. They are desperate. They have nothing. Yet in the early months of the war, every day there were 2 or 3 incidents with innocent people or people who were suspected of being sent by Hamas as spotters, end quote, with whom the soldiers in his battalion shot. The soldiers testified that throughout Gaza, corpses of Palestinians in civilian clothes remained scattered along the roads and open ground. S, a reservist, said, quote, the whole area was full of bodies. There are also dogs, cows, and horses that survived the bombings and have nowhere to go. We can't feed them, and we don't want them to get too close either. So you occasionally see dogs walking around with rotting body parts. There is a horrific smell of death, end quote. So you get the idea. And again, I remember those videos from Al Jazeera. You see them shooting people and then burying them. You see this picture of a horse that, man. But so it's just a really, again, confirmation that we know that they're shooting civilians in Gaza. And it has, goes to show that, when we talk about the death toll put out by Gaza's health ministry, which we'll get into in the next story, we say it doesn't account for the Palestinians trapped under the rubble in the buildings that were bombed. Well, it also doesn't account for the Palestinians who were shot and killed by the IDF and then buried. And they're saying this happened multiple times a day. So, how many Palestinians have been killed in this way and then just buried up and covered up? So important story. Go read the whole thing if you want. I should have given a warning before this for anybody that might be listening with their kids or something, because some really horrific imagery here that you get when you read this. All right, so the next one here, the Lancet says that the Gaza death toll could exceed 186,000. So the British medical journal The Lancet published an article on July 5th that estimates the actual death toll of Israel's U.S.-backed military campaign in Gaza could be over 186,000, even if there were a ceasefire today. The article, written by a group of experts, takes into account indirect deaths that have already taken place and will continue to happen to form this estimate. So the article reads, quote, armed conflicts have indirect health implications beyond the direct harm from violence. Even if the conflict ends immediately, there will continue to be many indirect deaths in the coming months and years from causes such as reproductive, communicable, and non-communicable diseases, end quote. The experts noted that the number of indirect deaths is expected to be large due to the destruction of Gaza's health sector and the severe shortages of food and other basic needs. They said that indirect deaths in recent conflicts range from 3 to 15 times the number of direct deaths. So they say, quote, applying a conservative estimate of 4 indirect deaths per 1 direct death to the 37,396 deaths reported, it is not implausible to estimate that up to 186,000 or even more deaths could be attributable to the current conflict in Gaza, end quote. So the way that I read this, the wording is a little confusing, is that they're talking this 186,000 would be the number of deaths if things ended today and there was a ceasefire. The deaths, in the coming months and years, as a result of this destruction of Gaza's, health infrastructure and just the total destruction of Gaza, is counted to get to that total of 186,000. But it's also the conservative estimate. They, again, when we're talking about Gaza, the indirect deaths are probably going to be higher than most other conflicts, considering the destruction of the infrastructure and the fact that people can't leave. And also the estimate that they use, the 37,396, the number that they use, that's based on figures put out by Gaza's health ministry on June 19th. And that number is 38,193. Again, considered to be a low estimate. The Lancet article said that estimates put the total number of bodies under the rubble that aren't being counted at over 10,000. So that would bring the death toll up to close to 50,000 of direct violent deaths. So then, you can multiply that number by 4. I mean, that gets you up to 200,000. But anyway, this is the estimate that they're putting out, 186,000 deaths. It accounts for 7.9% of Gaza's population. So about 8%, 1 in 12 Palestinians in Gaza. So it goes to show, who knows, unfortunately, it almost seems like we'll never know the true number of deaths in Gaza, but hopefully the picture becomes clear for us, and hopefully it doesn't end up being this high. But unfortunately, there's no real, I don't think the chances are very good of any kind of ceasefire deal at the moment. All right, so the next one here, the Latin Patriarchate condemns the Israeli bombing of a Catholic school in Gaza. So the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem, that is the Catholic authority in the Middle East, has strongly condemned the Israeli bombing of a Catholic school in Gaza City, which killed at least 4 Palestinians. The statement said, quote, "The Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem is monitoring with grave concern the news of the raids apparently launched by the Israeli army against the Holy Family School in Gaza this morning. Footage and media reports from the place include scenes of civilian casualties and destruction in the compound." End quote. So this happened early Sunday morning. I believe it was like overnight Saturday into Sunday when these strikes happened. The Patriarchate said that the school, which is the property of which is their property, has been a place of refuge for hundreds of civilians, and that no religious personnel currently reside there. The statement said, quote, "The Latin Patriarchate condemns in the strongest terms the targeting of civilians or any belligerent actions that fall short of ensuring that civilians remain outside the combat scene. We continue to pray for the Lord's mercy and hope that the parties will reach an agreement that would put an immediate end to the horrifying bloodbath and humanitarian catastrophe in the region," end quote. So Gaza's Civil Defense Agency said that among those killed in the strike was Ehab al-Ghussein, who is Gaza's Deputy Secretary of Labor, and his sister and wife were previously killed by Israeli airstrikes. So we've seen that Gaza's Catholic Church, the actual Catholic Church, and the parish sort of compound where Gaza's Christians, Catholics are sheltering. Other people are sheltering there as well. That came under attack back in December. The Holy Family Parish came under Israeli siege, and 2 Catholic women were killed by Israeli gunfire, and 7 people were wounded. And that attack was strongly condemned by the Latin Patriarchate and Pope Francis, who called it terrorism. And we've also seen Gaza's Orthodox Christians be targeted. The St. Porphyrius Church in Gaza City, a building there was bombed back in October, and it killed 18 Palestinian civilians, including relatives of Justin Amash, the former U.S. House Representative. So just another example of the how Gaza's Christian population, small but and dwindling population, is being affected by the Israeli bombing and everything. And IDF snipers killed those 2 women at the Catholic Church. So you see a picture here of the aftermath of the strike. All right, so the next one here, Palestinians homeless and hopeless as Israel storms Gaza City again. So this article is from Middle East Eye. So the Israeli military, they really ramped up operations in Gaza City. And Gaza City was the city that they initially, decimated, in October, November. And they've re-escalated there several times, and they're doing it again. The Israeli military launched a new massive assault on Gaza City in the early hours of Monday, forcibly displacing thousands of Palestinian families into the unknown in the dead of the night. The scene was likened to the Day of Judgment by eyewitnesses and survivors who said the bombing intensity was reminiscent of the initial invasion of Gaza at the start of the war. Heavy airstrikes started around midnight and lasted into the early hours of Monday, rocking the war-ravaged area and sending people into a panic. Under shelling, families were forced to leave Gaza City's eastern and southeastern areas on Sunday after Israel said it was going to operate there. Once people reached the city's western and southwestern and central neighborhoods, Israeli jets launched heavy bombardment near the areas that it forced people to take shelter in. So again, bombing the so-called safe zones. Patients at the Al Ali Arab Hospital, the only health facility partly operational in the area, were among those forced to flee. So another hospital had to be evacuated. The hospital was struck by 2 missiles as the Israeli military ordered everyone to leave. Hospitals, schools, shelters, homes, and other civilian facilities in the city have all but been destroyed in previous Israeli aerial and ground attacks over the past 9 months. So this Al Ali Arab Hospital was the hospital, I think it was, back in October, that was bombed, and there was this big debate over whether or not it was Israel or a stray Hamas rocket or Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that hit the hospital. Now Israeli missiles hit it. They forced people to evacuate, and it's barely made the news. And this also says that the Palestinians sheltering at the the Holy Family parish, the Catholic Church, they're in an area what's considered a red zone, which is basically one of these areas, if the IDF sees anybody, they're going to shoot them. So they cannot leave the facility. They can't leave the buildings there. All right, so the next one here, Lapid offers to support Netanyahu for the hostage deal. So Israeli opposition leader and former Prime Minister Yair Lapid on Monday said he would support Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu if he reaches a hostage and ceasefire deal with Hamas. Netanyahu's coalition government holds 64 out of the 120 seats in the Knesset, meaning only 5 members would need to quit for it to lose the majority, which would dissolve the government and force elections. So Israeli Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir has threatened that his Jewish Power Party, which holds 6 seats, would quit the government if Netanyahu agrees to a deal with Hamas. Polling shows that Netanyahu would lose if there were new elections, giving him the motive to continue the genocidal war to maintain his hold on power. So Yair Lapid, who leads the Yesh Atid party, and Lapid is a former prime minister, I think I mentioned that already, his party holds 24 seats in the Knesset, and he has previously offered to bail Netanyahu out if he reached a hostage deal and coalition members quit. He said, quote, "There's a hostage deal on the table. It is not true that Netanyahu has to choose between the hostage deal and his continued tenure as prime minister. I promised him a safety net, and I will keep that promise," end quote. He went on, he criticized Netanyahu, saying that he's a very failed prime minister and that he's to blame for October 7th. But he says, hey, I'm willing to, join the coalition to get the deal done. Lapid also criticized Netanyahu for releasing that list of non-negotiable demands for a hostage deal ahead of the renewed indirect talks with Hamas. Included in the list is a requirement that Israel will be able to restart military operations in Gaza, but Hamas's primary demand has been a permanent ceasefire. And an important point here is that, Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, these guys, they don't care about the destruction in Gaza, the killing of the Palestinians. But I think they do recognize that the Israeli military is failing in its goal to eradicate Hamas. And as this thing goes on, more and more hostages are going to be killed. So that's why they want a deal. And the whole thing is that the language in this potential deal is vague enough that Israel could agree, enter the first phase without actually having to commit to a permanent ceasefire. But Netanyahu is killing that ambiguity by constantly saying, no, we'll have to be able to restart, no permanent ceasefire. And that's why Israeli officials say he is trying to purposely sabotage the talks. All right, so the next one here, Hezbollah launches largest strike yet against Israeli mountain base. So this one's from Jason Ditz. Hezbollah officials announced Sunday that they had launched their biggest attack on Israel with a massive drone assault on the Mount Hermon reconnaissance base in the occupied Golan Heights. This was the biggest attack since the beginning of the tit-for-tat Israeli and Hezbollah attacks that started after October 7th. The attack comes as Hezbollah sent a flurry of explosive drones across the border, targeting the base, destroying electronic and surveillance systems, and starting a fire in the area. They said it was part of the retaliation for them killing Maitham Mustafa al-Attar, and he was a member of Hezbollah's air defense unit who was just killed by Israel. And another thing that's important in this article here is that Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, has said that a separate deal is needed with Hezbollah and that Israel fully intends to continue fighting Hezbollah even if there is a ceasefire in Gaza. Hezbollah has said a ceasefire in Gaza would stop attacking Israel. Israel's saying that they're not going to stop attacking Hezbollah, and Gallant has previously said they would actually escalate in Lebanon if there was a ceasefire in Gaza. All right, so the next one here, Zelensky says that Poland could down Russian missiles. So on Monday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that a new bilateral security pact he signed in Warsaw includes a mechanism for Poland to shoot down Russian missiles and drones. So this is concerning. We've seen Ukraine sign these bilateral deals with a lot of NATO countries, including the U.S. Many of them were just like kind of symbolic. But Zelensky is saying that this one includes a mechanism to shoot down Russian missiles and drones, a mechanism for Poland to shoot down Russian missiles and drones. He said, quote, "We are especially grateful for the special arrangements, and this is reflected in the security agreement. It provides for the development of a mechanism to shoot down by Poland Russian missiles and drones fired in the airspace of Ukraine in the direction of Poland," end quote. So I didn't see any comments from Tusk, the Polish prime minister who signed this deal with Zelensky, about this particular aspect of it. But this is something Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials are pushing for. They want NATO to shoot down Russian missiles, Russian drones, and that would mean direct NATO involvement in the war. And, Zelensky's trying to downplay it. No. You're not going to be killing Russians. You're just going to be downing missiles. But, of course, that means the air defense systems in Poland or wherever else that might be intercepting Russian missiles, they would become targets for Russia. That would mean Russian strikes on NATO territory. Just the escalation ladder would probably be climbed pretty quickly, and it could lead to direct war between NATO and Russia, World War III, nuclear war. It can't happen, but they're entertaining this idea, the European NATO countries. So this is very concerning potential escalation here. And Russian missiles have briefly entered Polish airspace during this war. Based on what Poland said, they kind of entered, they've, a few times have gone into Polish airspace and then gone out during Russia's attacks on Ukraine. I know we've seen drone fragments in Romania. There were some Russian strikes very close to Romanian territory in Ukraine, and all very concerning things. The only time that there was casualties in any of these incidents was when a Ukrainian air defense missile landed in Poland. That was back in 2022. It doesn't feel like it was that long ago. This was just the first year of the war. If you remember that, Ukrainian air defense missile landed in Poland and killed 2 people. And initially, the Ukrainians said it was a Russian missile. And they knew it was a Ukrainian missile, but they were trying to get NATO to intervene directly. And they had help from a U.S. official, some anonymous U.S. official who told AP that it was a Russian missile. So it was this huge... it was scary when that happened, if you remember that day. I remember that day very clearly when that story broke. The U.S. saying a Russian missile killed people on NATO, in Polish territory. But it turned out to be Ukrainian. And they lied about it because they want NATO to intervene directly in the war. And that's still what they want. All right, so the next one here, Russian missiles pound targets across 5 regions in Ukraine. So on Monday, Russia launched a massive missile attack across Ukraine, targeting 5 regions, including the capital Kiev, which faced its heaviest bombardment in about 4 months. According to Ukrainian authorities, 31 people were killed in the strikes. Ukrainian officials said a Russian missile struck a children's hospital in Kiev, while Moscow denied the claim and said evidence pointed to a Ukrainian air defense missile hitting the hospital. I saw all sorts of conflicting claims about this on Twitter. So I'm not sure exactly what happened, but the hospital was hit. And Ukrainian officials said at least 10 people were killed during the bombardment of Kiev, including 2 staff members at the hospital. They said 7 out of the city's 10 districts were targeted by Russia. And I know that's happened before when Ukrainian air defense missiles have hit buildings and then Ukraine blames it on Russia. There's a Ukrainian official, Arestovich was his last name. He was an advisor to Zelensky. He was actually fired for saying that in one of the cases it was a Ukrainian air defense missile. But anyway, this is very heavy bombardment by Russia. You can see this map from South Front here. These little red circles just show the, across Ukraine where the Russian strikes hit. Russia said that they destroyed 3 U.S.-made HIMARS rocket systems and claimed that they killed 10 foreign specialists who were operating them. And besides the strikes, battles across the front line just continue to rage. I mean, really heavy fighting is going on. And this Russian kind of escalation of missile strikes comes ahead of the big NATO summit, which starts on Tuesday in Washington. And they're going to announce some new support for Ukraine, but nothing, like concrete membership or anything like that. All right, the next one here, NATO wants 35 to 50 additional brigades. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The North Atlantic Alliance's new battle plans will require members to produce hundreds of thousands of new soldiers and military equipment for a potential war with Russia. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg claims the alliance has 500,000 soldiers at high readiness for conflict in Europe. A military source speaking with Reuters discussed the demands of the alliance's secret military plans. He said the strategy requires NATO members to create 35 to 50 brigades of 3,000 to 7,000 troops. The source admitted training and arming 100,000 to 350,000 new men is a significant challenge. The plans were agreed upon at last year's NATO summit in Lithuania and are expected to be updated at this week's alliance gathering in the U.S. So this is the NATO alliance. They created these new battle plans for war with Russia last year, something they haven't done since the Cold War, updated their plans for a war with Russia. Again, certainly a concerning thing, and they're really beefing up the presence of NATO in Eastern Europe. And this is all part of the plan. All right. So the next one here, Japan and the Philippines sign a new military pact. So on Monday, Japan and the Philippines signed a new defense pact that will allow the two nations to deploy troops to each other's territory, a step being taken as part of the U.S.-led military buildup against China in the region. According to AP, the deal was signed by the Philippine Defense Secretary and Japan's Foreign Minister in Manila during a ceremony that was witnessed by Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the Philippines president. The agreement will come into effect once ratified by both nations' respective legislatures. The deal will foster more military exercises between the two countries, including trilateral drills with the U.S. The deal comes a few months after President Biden hosted the first ever trilateral summit between the leaders of the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines. The U.S. has been encouraging its allies in the Asia-Pacific to boost bilateral military ties as part of its strategy against China. Last year, Japan signed a similar deal with Australia, which marked the first agreement of its kind that Tokyo has struck with another nation besides the U.S. in the post-World War II era. In a joint statement on Monday, the Japanese and Philippine ministers singled out China, expressing concern over what they called the dangerous and escalatory actions by Beijing at Second Thomas Shoal, referring to a Philippine-occupied reef in the South China Sea that's also claimed by China, Vietnam, and Taiwan. Since Marcos came into office in 2022, Chinese and Philippine vessels have had frequent tense encounters near the disputed reef. Marcos' predecessor, Duterte, had kind of an understanding with China about this reef. But Marcos has been emboldened by the U.S., which vows that the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty applies to attacks on Philippine boats in the South China Sea. So in response to the new military pact between the Philippines and Japan, of course, China condemned it. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said, quote, "The Asia-Pacific region does not need military blocs, let alone small groupings that instigate bloc confrontation or a new Cold War," end quote. So this is a big part of the U.S. strategy in Asia, and it's been moving along, even though we're so focused on Gaza and Ukraine for good reason. This stuff is moving along. In the past few years, we saw the U.S. announce a lot of things, plan a lot of things, put out strategies when it comes to preparing for war with China in the Asia Pacific. And we're seeing it, kind of come to fruition. We are seeing this alliance building happening in these new bases and new missiles being deployed. And, all this stuff is happening. We can't forget about it. All right, so the next one here, NATO seeks to expand partnerships with Indo-Pacific states. So this article is from the South China Morning Post. And this is another thing. NATO is openly saying, that they have to get involved in East Asia affairs. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization plans to expand its pool of partners from the strategically vital Indo-Pacific region, a senior U.S. official suggested while previewing the alliance's 75th anniversary summit this week in Washington. Michael Carpenter, senior director for Europe at the National Security Council, said, quote, "Certainly there are more partners that we have in the Indo-Pacific that are of great value to the NATO alliance, and we will seek to include other partners and other events in the future," end quote. And we've seen NATO kind of step up its rhetoric against China, accusing China of fueling the war in Ukraine and all of that stuff, and has essentially labeled China a major security threat to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So NATO wants to keep on expanding. All right, so the last story here, the Houthis warn the Saudis against the U.S. trap to reignite war. This one's from the Cradle. I thought this was an interesting story. So the leader of Yemen's ruling Ansar Allah resistance movement, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, on July 7th, warned Saudi Arabia against colluding with the U.S. and the U.K. to take aggressive steps against Sana'a and in support of Israel. So Sana'a is the capital of Yemen, which the Houthis have controlled since 2014. This is his quote. And it's interesting. So the Saudis have basically said that, they don't want to have warned the U.S. against escalations in Yemen when they started the bombing campaign against the Houthis, which is really something because for years the U.S. supported the Saudis as they decimated Yemen and slaughtered, countless civilians and helped impose this starvation blockade on Yemen. And now you have the Saudis saying to Biden, hey, cool it. I mean, it goes to show. They call the Crown Prince, Prince Bonesaw or whatever, he's got nothing on Biden the Butcher. So al-Houthi said, quote, "The Saudis must realize that their reckless, foolish steps cannot be tolerated and they must get off their misguided path. The U.S. sent us messages that it would push the Saudi regime to take aggressive steps against us, and there were American visits to Saudi Arabia for that reason. The Americans want to involve Saudi Arabia in a comprehensive war, meaning that the situation with us in Saudi Arabia will return to what it was at the height of the escalation," end quote. So he's saying that the U.S. has threatened the Houthis that they'll get the Saudis to restart their war. And you see what the U.S. is doing. They're currently blocking a peace deal between the Saudis and the Houthis with sanctions. Part of the deal, the Saudis agreed to pay government workers living in Houthi-controlled Yemen, which is where most people live. But U.S. sanctions are blocking that, and there's other ways that they're blocking it. So I think it's certainly possible that the U.S. made this threat to the Houthis, which, this should be a huge scandal, the fact that the U.S. is blocking this peace deal after this horrific war in Yemen. But few people are even aware of it. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints, one from Joseph Solis Mullen, Exposing Elite Cynicism with Satirical Truth. One from Ted Snyder, Is Putin Prepared to Compromise? One from Ramsey Baroud, Sharon Revisited, Netanyahu's Ultimate Aim in Gaza and Why It Will Fail. One from Doug Bandow, Learning to Live with a Nuclear North Korea. And one from James Carden, Trump Cabinet Hopeful Wants the Israel Model for U.S.-China Policy. So please go check all of that out. You could always support this show by sharing it. Tell your friends, like and subscribe, comment, all that stuff. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news for you. Thanks for listening.